first in world history space nation. Dr. Ajusbeli.
Greetings, my dear colleagues, participants and guests of the Asgardia's first Space and Investment Congress. Our Congress is dated to coincide not with the full moon we see today, but with the third anniversary of Asgardia, the first in the world history space nation that we celebrated 2 days ago on October 12th. We are more than 1 million Asgardians in more than 200 countries on Earth. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate all the Asgardians on our great national holiday. We have defined 12 main areas of Asgardia's national interests. But it is for a reason that the area of science was chosen as the main one for hosting our first global conference. In doing so, we set the core priority for our nation, long-term space exploration and settlement in space. The roadmap of this endeavor consists of the following 3 main areas: risks, opportunities, and goals. What is the risks? It would be dangerous to take on this long space journey a huge baggage of earthly problems accumulated over millennia. We simply cannot afford militarization of space by projecting earthly borders onto it. One should realize that only about 20 countries out of 229 have access to space. This is discrimination of space caliber against the countries which are unjustly called the third world countries, and against their citizens, and even simpler, against all Earthlings and Asgardians. National space agencies are selfish. They meet the objectives set forth by the governments that finance them, which is only natural. But who should solve the common space problems of humanity as a whole? What are the opportunities? Asgardia is capable of bringing global democracy to space science. Scientists in some countries today are constricted by national legislation, which is often far from freedom of creativity, communication, travel, and has many other limitations. I will start by brushing aside hypocritical speculation about risks of childbirth for both mother and child. Humanity would have never become what it is not today if our wooden vessels did not sail away from their warm or not so warm harbors into the unknown, to the shores which were not seen not only on Google Maps, but on any maps at all. We simply owe this chance to ourselves now, when the planet Earth is pretty much explored and finitude of human existence on Earth is already recognized. All the magnificent projects for settlement on Mars and similar extravaganza are one-way ticket in the absence of the first human child. It goes without saying, of course, that it will happen on the basis of indispensable comprehensive scientific research. Scientifically, this visionary mission rests on the following 3 pillars: biological viability, artificial gravity, and radiation protection. This is what is reflected in the logo of our Congress and Asgardia as a whole. From the financial point of view, for the benefit of the entire humankind, we will introduce also the concept of the space child tax. The low levels of this scientific pyramid will be holding many scientific investment projects, the number and novelty of which we cannot even imagine today. And this is what Asgardia was created for, to unite the scientists and investors from all over the world for solving the global task of preserving the humankind in the universe. I am stating with the confidence that from now on, the Space Science and Investment Congress of Asgardia will be held regularly. I wish you successful, fruitful work and friendly, constructive networking. Good. High-tech technology. Okay, and now I hand over to the president of our Congress, Dr. Floris Weitz, professor at the University of Antwerp, and at the same time the Ministry of Science of Asgardia. Thank you for attention. Mr. Floris, now you will do something with this.
So don't touch the buttons when you're leaning against the wall, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Ajubeli, for your visionary words. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues, obviously it's a great pleasure to address you as the first president of the first Asgardia Space Science and Investment Congress, ASIC 2019. I'm tremendously pleased to announce that actually there are more than 20 top-level keynote speakers from all over the world, but as well as 50 speakers and poster presenters. It's an honor to have you here. Except from Antarctica, there are people from all continents in the world, as well as more than 20 countries. I want to express the greetings also from Rolf Densing, director of the European Space Operations Center here in Darmstadt, who says, and I quote his words, "On a personal basis, I'm very supportive of Asgardia's 3 top goals. First, to ensure the peaceful use of space. Second, to protect the Earth from space hazards. And third, to create a demilitarized and free scientific base of knowledge in space. So far," he says, "ESA has a very similar purpose as our convention calls upon using space for research and technology, and doing so for exclusively peaceful purposes. Moreover, the ESA Director General will be proposing a comprehensive program to European space ministers later this year on space safety and security, to protect Earth from hazards originating in space, and to use our assets in space to better protect our planet. In line with the motto," he finally concludes, "in line with the motto of your Congress, I'm wishing you very much success in paving the road to living in space." Rolf Densing. Thank you for his word. So, dear colleagues, actually, allow me to ask you to, for a very brief time, think of how your grandparents, how did they go on their honeymoon? Something like, 50, 70, 60 years ago, or even longer ago. If they went to the local seaside, then they were lucky if it was in a perimeter of like 100 kilometers. Now we travel to the other side of the world. We have here Professor Satoshi Iwase from Japan. We have people from Boston. We have people from all over the world. It's really a piece of cake to fly, to travel over the world. How will it be in 100 years? We can't imagine, actually. It is very difficult. We definitely know that progression is non-linear. Future is actually not predictable, because if it would be predictable, there would be no room for creativity. I just want to end with a couple of slides. Actually, I found in a little brochure called Constellation. Can I have my slides, please? So it's actually a little brochure I found while moving. It's dating from 1965. And it has, so it should be showing on the other screen. So it was a prediction of what is going to happen in the future. So it's called, it's in French, and I hope they switch computers, so it should be immersed. So the point is, in 65, they wanted to imagine what is going to happen until 2050. So they really forecasted 50 years. Okay, so this is the little booklet. How we'll be living tomorrow. Next slide, please. So on the left side, it's the original. Can I have the next? Yes. You can't read, but I made it the translation in English. So in 67, they said usage of satellites for weather forecast. Okay, check. 1970 manned moon landing, yes, they'd done it in 69. But then it becomes really wild. In 1975, reusable rockets. Okay, we are there, but not in 75. A temporary base on the moon, not really. In 78, manned flight around Mars and Venus. Wow. In 82, permanent moon bases. In 85, landing on Mars. In 1990, fabrication of materials on the moon. And in 2020, landing on Jupiter. Wow. 2050, commercial traffic to the moon. Perhaps if we work hard, we can make this happen in another 30 years. So we really have to catch up. Paving the way for living in space has to be addressed more than anything else, actually. Looking at numerous characteristics at the same time. That's the big challenge of space research. And that's why this Congress has no parallel sessions. It is all plenary. We will be here locked in this room 2.5 days. But we will be, let's say, stimulated by different fields, by different disciplines. So people who are expert in radiation will hear about artificial gravity and vice versa, and about procreation. So this is really a fantastic thing. So we will have the occasion to look into the domain of expertise of your colleagues and learn to serve humanity. Thank you very much for being here. I hope you will enjoy the Congress, and I'm gladly now handing over the first session to the hands of Professor Ana Diaz-Artiles from A&M University in Texas. The floor is yours.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be the first chair of the first session on artificial gravity of this first Asgardia Space Science and Investment Congress. We are hosting a series of extremely renowned speakers on artificial gravity, so it's going to be really exciting. A little bit of logistics, please leave the questions for the end of the session. We'll have a round table and everyone will have the opportunity to ask the questions to speakers. So I'm really honored to introduce our first speaker. Is Professor Larry Young from MIT. Professor Young is a professor of astronautics and professor of health science and technology at MIT. He was the founding director of the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, and he directed the HST PhD program in bioastronautics. Dr. Young was elected to the National Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Science, and he is also a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics. He is not only an accomplished scientist and engineer, but he is also a wonderful mentor, always providing incredible opportunities to his students. Dr. Young will talk about artificial gravity and its capability of being an overall antidote against the space deconditioning. So please welcome Professor Larry Young.
Thank you. And you were going to provide me with a portable microphone?
Yeah, this is forward and this is backward.
And the pointer.
Okay.
Well, it's easy to be a professor with a lot of publications when you have students like our chairman. And it's been my great pleasure over the career to have worked with a number of you here in the audience on pushing the boundaries of space explorations, and particularly now to look at the dreams that we're hearing through Asgardia and our participants. What I've been asked to do today is to give you a review of the background and the history of artificial gravity, and to squeeze to the extent possible into this half hour a full semester course which we give at MIT on sensory motor systems. So bear with me. It's going to go by rapidly, but we will have an opportunity to discuss details a little bit later on. Humans in space, space colonization, the dreams of Asgardia are not a new idea. We'll come back to this later, but many of you will recognize Professor Jerry O'Neill's space wheel, his space colony, which, by the way, includes artificial gravity and rotation. Now, am I pointing this in the wrong direction? Well, okay. What I plan to do this afternoon is go through some of the things that have been tried. What have we learned about artificial gravity over the 50 or more years that we've been experimenting with it, and in particular, what needs to be done in the future? There have been, at regular intervals, every 6 to 8 years, a review of artificial gravity. Here are some of the important ones that I've been involved with. A number of the slides that I'll be showing you this afternoon were put together by Ana Diaz when she was still my PhD student at MIT, and I'm very grateful to her for doing that. Much of the background was summarized in a very lovely book by Gilles Clément and Angie Buckley entitled Artificial Gravity. So this material has been documented, but it's often forgotten. The very first appearance of artificial gravity in writing that I'm aware of goes back to the 19th century when Konstantin Tsiolkovsky published this little sketch in which we see little humans out at the rim of this rotating device. We see counterbalances to be able to help to go from the rim at high G down to the center of rotation at 0 G. The publication actually didn't appear until the 1950s. It was quickly supplanted by the imagination of people like von Nordung and his colleagues in Austria and in Germany, and it became so popular that the notion was quickly adopted by the science fiction community. It produced the vastly popular series on the Disney Channel called Man in Space. Man in Space, in which we had a large rotating spacecraft and vehicles like the shuttle could dock with it. There was a series of articles based upon Wernher von Braun's mission to Mars concepts, which was published in Collier's magazine. But once again, large rotating devices, and it even made it to Tintin. Tintin's voyage to the moon was enabled with a nuclear rocket, which would accelerate him at 1 G halfway to the moon, turn around, and then decelerate for the remainder of the trip. Probably the most popular of all of these endeavors in the 50s, I hope everybody is familiar with, was the rendition of Arthur Clarke's book on 2001, The Space Odyssey, made into this marvelous film by Stanley Kubrick, which really, in my experience as a professor, has inspired more students than any other single event, including the early days of the Apollo program. Inside the Discovery, in the Kubrick movie, the astronauts could walk around the rim. They could proceed from the 1D circumference, proceed by a series of ladders up to the inner hub, which was at 0 G, and up and down this ladder they could proceed doing something which is easy in Hollywood but hard in space, and that is eliminate Coriolis forces. So as they went up and down, they were not being pushed sideways. Hollywood, of course, could do it more easily, as in this Frank Sinatra. I'm sorry, this is I've just forgotten. Fred Astaire, this wonderful Fred Astaire movie in which he walks on the ceiling. No, that's no problem. But when doing these things in reality was a little more difficult. I referred to Jerry O'Neill's work earlier. There was a space station concept funded by NASA in 1977, which we'll get to in more detail. And the Stanford tourists was just loaded with a city. You look at these are city blocks and transportation all inside a rotating device. So this is not a new idea. The question is, what we'll get into is what have we learned? What have we learned and what remains to be done? Okay, there was a lot of interest in artificial gravity as we reached the Apollo period and then the post-Apollo period, largely with sponsorship in the U.S. at any rate from NASA. The Lockheed design shown here had living quarters out in these outer arms which were rotating around a central core and a nuclear propulsion unit located out at one end, a docking unit at the other end. I'll show you some others that came into play. NASA was interested in self-inflating, rotating hexagons in which they would come up as rather small packages which could then be inflated like big balloons. They looked at a rotating spacecraft in which the individual elements were spent fuel tanks from the Apollo program. Meanwhile, there were a number of people in the space physiology area all over the world who were interested in flying animals in space. And the simple question to begin was will artificial gravity, as represented by a centrifuge on an orbital vehicle, substitute for normal 1G gravity here in our laboratories? To that extent, the lead was taken by our friends in the then Soviet Union, who flew a series of Cosmos missions, originally in 1975 with fish and turtles, which were centrifuged at 1G, and then somewhat later, in 1977, very important Cosmos 936 experiment. We'll see another picture of that, in which rats were centrifuged at 1G. And most importantly, the animals that were subjected to centrifugation in orbit were indistinguishable from the animals which went through parallel training or parallel exposure here on Earth. In other words, everything that we learned from these rodents said that artificial gravity should be an effective substitute for the normal real gravity here on Earth. But it was done only at 1G and it didn't explore the entire range. This is a summary of Cosmos 782 and a picture of it. And here we have what we found on Cosmos, I don't know why. That's the 782 and 986 with rats showed, as we show here, the inhibition of the deleterious effects of microgravity by centrifuging rats at 1G. So it all looked positive in terms of supporting the notion of putting people in space with 1G artificial gravity, at least, to prevent the negative consequences of space deconditioning. Okay, but that's theory. What else was being constructed? Well, we had yet to put anything in space which was really an acceleration or a rotator. The closest we got was NASA, in conjunction with ESA, flew the D1 on the D1 mission, a linear sled, low acceleration levels, 0.2 of a G up to brief 1G periods, and it would allow the subject to be accelerated up and down with rather short length of the space lab in order to determine whether the vestibular responses to transient accelerations were changed after exposure to weightlessness. A highly successful set of experiments, but it didn't answer the chief questions that I posed earlier about the adequacy of zero-G, of AG. Now, I'll show you just pictures of a number of the rotating devices which have been flown, and I'll limit myself to the U.S. program for this presentation, all of which were supportive of the success of AG, but not conclusive. The microgravity vestibular investigation flew on the Space Shuttle 42, but they were spun about an axis which was more or less through their midsection. Here are the feet, here's the head, and so the centrifugal forces, instead of being entirely footward, were footward from the midsection downward and were headward from the midsection upward. So blood was being forced up to the head, which is the opposite direction of what you would want artificial gravity to do. Okay, another centrifuge flew on the Neurolab mission at the very end of the space labs. We had 4 subjects. They developed a headward sense of down, which is consistent with the notion that the net gravito-inertial vector, the sum of linear acceleration plus gravity, is what is determining your postural vertical. So this, in fact, this idea, which is, of course, was introduced classically by Ernst Mach in the late 19th century, turned out to be nicely proven by space experiments as well. There were designs for in-flight centrifuges worked out jointly by NASA and the U.S. Air Force, which did not fly. In the 1992, we flew the microgravity vestibular investigations. I showed you a picture of this a little bit earlier. As well as the Neurolab experiment. It's a little hard to see on this, but you can see the subject's head. It would be up here. Here are his buttocks, his knees, his feet. So, but he's being spun about an axis which would be moving the fluid from his midsection toward the head as well as from the midsection down toward the feet. So it really was not an adequate demonstration of AG as we would like to see it used. Okay, by the time we got to STS-90, the Neurolab mission at the end of the space arena, we were pretty much answered the questions about functioning of the vestibular system after exposure to weightlessness. And the simple answer is the semicircular canals are relatively unaffected. The otolith organ signals are reinterpreted to represent linear acceleration as opposed to tilt relative to the vertical. Vertical loses its meaning in weightlessness. Meanwhile, some important ground experiments have been going on. The notion of adapting people in a rotating room goes back to the experiments in Pensacola, Florida, at the Navy laboratory conducted by Dr. Fred Gedry, along with Dr. Graybiel. Those you may recall showed that people could adapt to working in a rotating environment, but they would adapt only to specific body orientations and specific directions of head movements. These were continued at Brandeis University in their slow rotating room, and in fact continue to this day. We had a short radius centrifuge at MIT, which we modified to meet the space constraints of putting it onto the International Space Station. This grew out of our work with Professor Iwasi, and we were able to show that, in fact, we can adapt people to head movements in a rotating environment as long as we do it incrementally, that we were able to increase our confidence that we could take any one of you, have you spinning around, making head movements, and learn to do it without motion sickness, providing we increase the rotation rate incrementally from one day to the next. And we could overcome the arbitrary boundary which had been set as 6 revolutions per minute. So this was the MIT short radius centrifuge, and I guess I've been widely quoted by saying artificial gravity is an idea. It's come around and around and around. Okay, many concepts for putting this in space. None of them came to fruition. This was of the Manned Orbiting Research Laboratory, which was designed at Langley but never flew. Another design was to go in the Lunar Excursion Module in the Apollo complex. On the ground, the question arose about whether the ground centrifuges should have the G vector be a linear combination. Latter idea of our colleagues at the University of California designed a system in which you would be on a gondola and have the acceleration be aligned always along with your body axis, which I think is much more representative of what we would like to see in a space centrifuge. Meanwhile, development of space centrifuges was going on at NASA Ames Research Center. Centrifuges were developed, which would allow you to either power it by bicycle or have it motorized. Two subjects, heads toward the center, feet toward the rim. Another one developed by Wiley for NASA, with Bill Pawlowski and I oversaw, was used at the University of Texas medical branch, shown here. The European Space Agency developed two, one of which was in Toulouse, and one in Cologne. And I don't have time to go into their details. I don't. Okay. Meanwhile, large radius centrifuges, which had been principally of interest for the armed forces, looking at what's called G-LOC, G-induced loss of consciousness, were available in the U.S. through the Navy and again the Air Force centrifuge at San Antonio, Texas, and the result of many of these experiments over several decades was the attempt to define an acceptable region, a habitable region for artificial gravity. This is the only data that I'm showing you. This is from Ralph Stone's summary of the radius of the centrifuge, and you notice that these are fairly large, from 6 meters up to 48 meters. The revolution speed, this is at 6 RPM, and the notion that was imposed was that you want to keep the revolution slower than 6 RPM so as to avoid motion sickness. We've been able to back away from that over the years, but this is where we stood. That the radius would have to be larger than 12 RPM to eliminate the gravity gradient, so that G level would be the same up at head level as it would be down at foot load, as well as to deal with Coriolis forces. Okay, so that's where we were as we entered this period of asking the basic questions about artificial gravity in space. Okay, so what have we learned, and then what do we still have to do? And I'm going to conclude with that. What did we learn in the early days? First of all, we learned to respect Dr. Graybiel and how valuable his insights were. We learned to look at the differences between the results of the early Soviet cosmonaut experience and of the early American astronaut experience, and ask ourselves why they were so different, and why were the American astronauts not getting space motion sickness, whereas many of the Soviet cosmonauts were. The early experience was that there was no space motion sickness reported. Doesn't say it didn't exist. None reported on Mercury or on Gemini, and it wasn't until Apollo 8 that my classmate and friend Rusty Schweikert vomited during a brief EVA that we had to admit that yes, Americans were getting space motion sickness as well. And the scorecard for the Apollo astronauts, as indicated here, was that 9 out of the 25 Apollo astronauts developed space motion sickness. 2 out of those 9 had negative motion sickness histories. Their questionnaires show that these people would appear to be immune. So we were left with the issue of how do you predict susceptibility to space motion sickness. How to predict which one of us would likely to be immune when going into space. The answer would appear primarily to be that the size of the vehicle was critical. The Soviet vehicles from the beginning were larger and allowed more movement than did the American vehicles. When the Americans finally got up to sizes like Apollo, in which you could actually move around and make head movements, then the incidence of space motion sickness arose as well. So the revival of interest in what's the vestibular functions in space and how does this relate to artificial gravity were not driven by basic science questions. They were driven by operational issues. And these 7 questions, which I'll ask you to look at for a moment, was what drove the continuing research on artificial gravity and adaptation. Is pre-flight training effective for adaptation? Are there certain kinds of head movements which need to be avoided? Are there better drug treatments than the ones that were used at the time, primarily promethazine and scopolamine? What about using biofeedback to train people to recognize their early symptoms of space motion sickness? Can we use incremental counter rotation on a rotating spacecraft? I think it's a very good idea, and my answer is probably so, but hasn't been fit. What about onboard incremental rotations, and can proprioception be disturbed? Is pointing impaired? Can we predict susceptibility? And what about post-flight? You've all seen pictures of astronauts immediately post-flight being lifted out of the Soyuz or being taken down from the shuttle and just barely able to walk a straight line. What can be done about that? So, I referred to the animal experiments. I'll just skip by them. Let me talk finally about some of the ideas which were suggested, seem sensible, but either didn't work out or haven't been sufficiently tested to this time. And that's really the challenge to all of us. Which ones of these need to be followed further before we can address our primary challenge? At first it was thought that we could avoid DSMS, dreaded space motion sickness, by selecting only males and selecting only fighter pilots. That looked good for a while, but it's not true. That we could provide a cervical collar to eliminate or reduce head movements. Well, as one of my astronauts who tried out our cervical collar said to me, Larry, if you have a broken leg, you don't need anybody to tell you don't step on the broken leg. You don't need a cervical collar to tell you not to make head movements when every head movement was going to induce nausea. We could try biofeedback. It was tried briefly without conclusion. We could try devices in the laboratory in which your linear motion would be associated with the rotation of the visual field to try to reproduce some of the visual vestibular conflict which we feel is present when you're making movements on orbit. That's been tried. It is still, the apparatus is still in place at the Johnson Space Center, but it's not been conclusive. We could select people who appeared to be left-right symmetric with respect to their otolith function, and there was a lot of interest, particularly in Russia and in Germany, on otolith asymmetry as the underlying cause of space motion sickness. So when you put your head on your side in zero G, you would have a different bias in the left utricular otolith than you would in the right utricular otolith. Still more work needs to be done to pursue that, but certainly not a closed story now. We could select people for vestibular thresholds, as was done in pilot training going back to the Second World War, without knowing whether you really want high thresholds or low thresholds. Or we could use questionnaires to select for motion sickness susceptibility. So That's a fairly long list, as well as always the need for better pre-medication. And finally, I'm sure everybody in this audience gets asked by our neighbors and friends what to do about motion sickness. I'm about to go out on a cruise ship. What should I use to prevent motion sickness? And you know the most popular answer that we get from the public? The most popular answer is ginger. You would not believe how popular it is. Is there any scientific basis for it? Dr. Iwasi, is there any scientific basis for ginger? None. Nevertheless, it remains very popular, and it tastes pretty good. Okay, so here are some of the theories which did not pan out, at least yet. One is that fluid shift, which we all know exists on orbit, as loss of fluid and fluid shift in a caudal direction, is responsible for space motion sickness. It's not. It's been proven with bed rest studies that there's no change in nystagmus, no change in vestibular responses associated with fluid shift. That Robert Barony was wrong. Well, he was mistaken. There were other causes of vestibular responses in space other than convection. Okay, so there's a lot of work was done on modeling. I've just gotten a signal from out of that, so I can't go into detail on any of these theories, but believe me, there has been significant advances in theories of sensory motor integration. So here are just the names of them, and I'll be happy to fill in some of the details later. So what do we still have to do? We still have to fly human centrifuges in space. We've been saying this for years. Dr. Clément, Dr. Voits, Dr. Iwasi, myself and others have been working on this. We have not yet succeeded in getting an adequate test on orbit. The closest we got was a program called AGREE, led by Dr. Iwasi in Japan, in which a subject seated on this device could be rotated inside a module of the International Space Station at different G levels for various times of intermittent centrifugation, and we could measure all the vestibular and non-vestibular responses. A version of this that could be fitted to the space station is, in my opinion, the most important next step to answering these critical questions. This is a version that in Dr. Iwasi's lab in Nagoya, and these are the questions that would have to be answered using a rotating device in space. So my closing slide is keep on spinning. We've been at it for a long time. There is work to be done, and before we achieve the dream of Asgardia, we're going to have to get these answers. Thank you.
Next, can you hear me? Yeah. Our next speaker is Dr. Jack van Loon from University Medical Center in the Netherlands. Dr. van Loon has experience in space and gravity-related research for more than a quarter of a century. He has been investigator of several space experiments in parabolic flight, the shuttle, Bion, Soyuz, and the ISS. Van Loon initiated and set the requirements of the ESA large diameter centrifuge at ESA ESTEC and also coordinates its use. He also coordinates the activities regarding the establishment of a large human centrifuge, which is called the Human Hypergravity Habitat, H3. Please welcome Dr. Jack van Loon.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this microphone working? Okay. And this is also working. Yeah, okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, for being able to say something about gravity-related research, and thank you, Larry, for introducing a lot of it. So there's some overlap to what I show you, but I think it gives you some extra information as well. The strong nuclear force and the electromagnetic force, we have gravity. The good thing about gravity is that it acts over a huge distance. So here I took 24 orders of magnitude. So going from the Milky Way all the way to a molecular level, gravity has an effect. Yeah, compared to the other three, which are working on a very short distance. Takes the speed away. And gravity has an impact on mass. So here you see 4 species, a rat or mouse, a dog, a human, and an elephant. And if you look at these species, basically, is there another way to make this happen a bit more smoothly than what it is now? Basically, in all these animals, you see the same features if you look at the skeleton of these animals. I mean, they have extremities, they have a skull, they have rib cages, they have a spine. It's the same in both an elephant and a cat. The huge difference between these two is that you have a much more thicker bone in these heavy animals, in these elephants, compared to a cat. Principles are the same, but the weight of these animals determines the mass of the skeleton. Yeah. You have a new one? Thank you. Okay. And this is the pointer? Yes. This is an experiment I did a long time ago, 25 years or so ago, in the shuttle. We used very small metatarsal long bones, mouse. Fetus is metatarsal long bones. They are about 1.5 millimeter long. And also in these isolated bones, you see that under microgravity, under weightlessness, near weightlessness conditions, you have far more mineral in these bones as you compare to the 1G in-flight control. So even as an isolated, very small bone, you see similar effects as you see on Earth with these animals. It is also the musculoskeletal system which was very much driving our, let's say, living on land. Yeah, here we have the Tiktaalik, which lived about 375 million years ago. This is our ancestors, let's say. And it's because of the strength of its musculoskeletal system that it was able to go from a buoyant situation in sea to go onto land. So gravity has an important role there. Gravity also has an important role in evolution. This is a nice example of how gravity plays a role in evolution of snakes. And we have 3 snakes here: an arboreal snake, so a tree-living snake, an aquatic snake, and a sort of intermediate version. An aquatic snake is a snake that lives most of its life in a horizontal position. So you don't have a hydrostatic pressure differences in these snakes. While in an arboreal snake, it climbs up the tree and it climbs down the tree, so you have this hydrostatic pressure differences all the time when it moves in the tree. So what you see in the position of the heart, which is you see in the red part here, is if you have these high changes in hydrostatic pressure, you see that the heart is much closer to the head. The main function of the heart is to provide oxygen and food to the brain. That is the most important organ in the system. So the brain needs to be provided with blood, very reliably. So the heart is much closer to the brain than what you see with the aquatic snake, which lives horizontally. So also there you see that over time, many years, gravity plays a role. Now we have a human being that goes into space, into flight. This is some data from the Mir crew by Laurence Vicot, looking into bone, and especially I draw your attention in the mineral content of these bones in weight-bearing bones. Yeah, and what you see in flight, so it's a 6-month mission, I think, for these experiments, is that you see in all these cosmonauts, you see a reduction in bone mass. Yeah, so you lose bone. So the body is not adapted to live under a near weightlessness environment. So this is what you see, and this is supposed to work. We tested it, but none of them do, I see. Hello. Okay, sorry. Anyhow, I mean, a lot of exercise is being done in flight, about 1.5 or 2 hours each day, 5 days a week, to maintain, a good cardiovascular system, bone and muscle, or try to maintain. Because if you look at the more recent study, also by Laurent Vicot, again looking into cosmonauts that did all these training over the years, you see that in these cosmonauts, after half a year of flight and then measured a year after return at 1G, so on Earth, you still see a lot of these bone parameters which are still not at a pre-flight level. So even a year after return, and with all these training, it is still not good enough to maintain at least a good bone architecture. I should have used my own computer. This is also not working. Anyhow, the other problem you have is the fluid shift. I was explained earlier by Larry. The fluid shift, so the fluid moves up to the upper part of the body, is what you see here. You get chicken legs. And the fluid shift, it's okay. It's an adaptation of the body. When you go into flight, it takes about a couple of days to redistribute. The problem lies, especially when coming back, and this was a very well-known video clip of an astronaut that really fainted at the press conference. Actually, she fainted twice at the press conference because of the orthostatic intolerance. So the body is not able to, let's say, to resupply the brain with sufficient amount of blood after the flight. Just leave it, Floris, it's okay. Another problem which is, let's say, more recently identified in crew is the increase in core body temperature. This is what you see in crew, which is either at rest or does exercise in flight. And this is the flight period, a bit grayish, you see here. And you see an increase in body temperature of nearly 2 degrees in this exercise group, which is really a huge increase in body temperature. And it's not very healthy. It also, it also triggers, let's say, a sort of inflammation physiology in these astronauts. Do I get extra time? Yeah, it works. The other thing is, which is, let's say, got pretty much attention the last couple of years, 5, 6, 7 years, is the VIP or SANS, the visual impairment due to intracranial pressure, as it was called. Now it's called space-associated neuroocular syndrome, which is basically, let's say, aberrations in the visual system of the crew, and especially in crew that went on long-duration missions. You see all kinds of changes at various parts of this visual system. And what you also see, and this is some work from Donna Roberts, some paper a couple of years ago, is that you see changes in the morphology of the brain. The gray and white area of the brain, pre-flight and post-flight, you see the difference between the two. And it's also not known why this, what triggers this. It might be also a fluid shift, it might be something else. Larry also introduced some of the animal stuff. Why is it going forward? Back. Some of the animal experiments. Okay. Here you see a more recent experiment with a Japanese facility where they had mice either under microgravity condition. So this one is sleeping, actually. Yeah, if you can get it working. The only thing with the sleeping animal is that you see this claw moving a bit. That one is also sleeping. If you look carefully, you see it breathing, but it's not moving too much. Anyhow, a lot of the parameters in here, they looked at muscle and bone-related parameters. A lot of these animals, either under microgravity conditions or in-flight 1G centrifuge conditions, you see a lot of these bone and muscle parameters being maintained in a good way in these animals under 1G in-flight artificial gravity. That's in-flight artificial gravity. All these animals you see here have been on ground for a long period of time in the centrifuge. So not a couple of hours or a couple of days, but really weeks, months, and sometimes years. We had some rats in our centrifuge in Amsterdam a couple of years ago. They lived under 2.5 G for more than a year. Yeah. So these are really long-duration hypergravity studies in animals. But the point is, we don't know anything about how hypergravity would respond We don't know. This is quite annoying. We don't know anything about hypergravity, long duration hypergravity, and humans. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to address here. Okay, this is an experiment using Drosophila, so not human, but a very model animal, a fruit fly. What happened with the fruit fly is that we affected it with a fungi, so you get an immune response in these animals. And then we look at the longevity of these animals, so the time it takes for them to die. So this is the blue line here. You see that when you infect these animals, and this is the rate of survival, these are days, you see that because of this infection, the animals are going to die more and more over time. Yeah? The funny thing is, if you do exactly the same experiment, but then put these animals in at 4G, so 4 times Earth gravity, you see that far more animals survive. Yeah? So somehow, hypergravity has let's say, a healing or prophylactic effect onto these animals. This is another study done in Korea on mice where they, similar thing, they challenged them with asthma or rhinitis in these animals, and then they put them under chronic hypergravity, 5 Gs for nearly a month. Yeah? And what you see in these animals, these are the control animals, group A, and compare that to group D, which had the rhinitis and the 5G challenge. You see that in a lot of these parameters, and these are inflammatory cells and also some of the gene expressed during this inflammation, you see that also here that the 5G had a very positive effect with respect to the immune response in these animals over time. Long duration experiment, constant hypergravity environment. Vestibular and muscle system. If you put an animal, I think it's under 3G, 3G here for 4 weeks, about the same time, you see the effect of gravity, for instance, here in muscle indicators. So you have an increase in muscle weight at 3G compared to the 1G control. For bone parameters, you also see here a decrease in rank L and OPG measurements in a wild-type mouse. If you make a vestibular lesion to these mouse, so you stop the vestibular function in these mice, you don't see these effects anymore. So the vestibular system has a strong effect on how muscle and bone responds in a different gravity environment. This is an experiment we did some time ago, where we had an arthropod, a small insect, let's say, for a week or 2 weeks under 2G or 4G conditions, and we looked into fat mass of these animals. You see a reduction in fat mass of these animals compared to their 1G controls. You also see that in mammals, in the New Zealand rat, Dutch rabbit, in the guinea pig, rats or hamsters, you see that at 2G, all these animals have a reduced fat mass over time. You can also look at a more recent study here from Charlie Wade at the NASA Ames Research Center, is that they reduce in body mass, but especially they reduce in fat mass in these animals. And this is, again, long duration hypergravity conditions. So can we do something about long duration hypergravity and human beings? So can we do something about one of these, let's say, obesity issues we have nowadays in our Western society? This is an old image, quite some time ago, but it makes the point in how a human body adapts to microgravity near weightlessness conditions. Yeah? This is a timeline in months, 1 month, 1.5, 3, and so on. And this is a gravity level where you have here the microgravity set point, and this is the 1G. So if you're launched, you go into flight, you see the very first function, as Professor Young mentioned earlier, the neurovestibular function is very rapidly challenged going into near weightlessness conditions. Fluid and electrolytes are coming a bit later, but also quickly responding, and so on. Basically, it takes about 6 weeks that you get some sort of steady state in the body, except for radiation effect and except for bone. But a lot of these other systems, they adapt in about 6 weeks' time. So this is what we know about the human body under near weightlessness or microgravity conditions. This is what we know about the human body under hypergravity conditions. And this, I mean, and it's very difficult to see here, this part, the very small white part to the left. Yeah? We don't know anything about long duration human adaptation to hypergravity conditions. So this whole area needs to be explored, if you ask me. So this is what we know about the human body and gravity. Of course, depending where you are in the world and how fortunate you are in food conditions and so on, you live about 80 years at 1G. That is what we know the best. I mean, I have some people on the moon for a couple of days, a couple of hours. The one longest in space is Gennady Padalka, 879 days. He's going for another trip. He wants to hit the 100,000, I understood. So this is hypogravity. If you look to the other side of the spectrum, and again, sorry that the videos don't work, you see this one person going up to 8 and 9G, a fighter pilot really training to have these large gravity loads to his body. He's able to do that. This is really in the order of seconds to mostly a minute. And then there are some experiments done on either research centrifuges or training centrifuges in the order of hours. But we don't know anything about what happens in, let's say, long duration, mild hypergravity environments. What happens to the human body if you would do that? So a couple of years ago, we started with a project to see whether we can make a very large centrifuge. Yeah? The first approach was to have a 300-meter diameter track, actually a train rails, where we put a train on, and when you run it for 170 kilometers an hour, you can generate about 1.5 G, and you can do that 24/7. There is some technology where you can have quite steady and long duration speeds with these trains, so the technology is more or less there. And the good thing is, if you look in this maglev levitation technology, you have a very smooth running facility where you can expose humans for long duration to hypergravity conditions. So we ended up with a concept called the human hypergravity habitat, H3. And maybe if you look carefully, you still see that the track here with the train is now covered to protect from the outside world. But this is a system where we can start to learn how the human body responds to long duration, mild hypergravity conditions. So not high Gs, probably not more than 2 Gs, but we don't know exactly what a human body can endure for a long duration of time. So this is about an overview of the sort of centrifuges we have in the world. Most attention goes to the, let's say, the short arm centrifuges that was introduced by Larry Young in the previous lecture. But you have systems in Toulouse, in Nagoya, in Boston, in Cologne, Shenzhen, and so on. These are really centrifuges that could operate inside the spacecraft. Yeah? On the other hand, you have sort of intermediate centrifuges with a diameter of about 30 meters, of 25 meters, in the Nautilus study of NASA. And then you have other studies where the whole space station would rotate, like in the Fire Baton station. What we are looking at is really a very large system that completely rotates. Yeah? You've seen some of these images before. Of course, Tsiolkovsky was the first, and did not have the very first image, but more his rotating spacecraft here, where the red things here are humans. These are trees. There was this idea in 1903 to have this rotating spacecraft. You have Nordung, the Von Braun station, and of course the Kubrick movie. There is a video moving here. But the closest we ever got in-flight gravity, longer arm gravity, was the Skylab crew that actually ran around and created their own artificial gravity while running. Yeah, I mean, you have this comfort zone, as Larry mentioned, and this is really going into very large radii systems. This is 100 meters or 1,000 meters. And you have this comfort zone where, although we know now that we can adapt to rotation, but these are really systems where you can freely move, and we don't know too much about how the human body responds in a freely moving, rotating, large diameter system. One of the things you have in these large systems compared to the small ones is that you have a very small body gradient with respect to gravity. You know, if you look into this H3 system I just introduced, the body gradient being in the centrifuge with respect to, let's say, the gravity gradient in the body is only 2%. If you go to a small centrifuges like the ESA short-arm human centrifuge, it's like more than 300% body gradient you have in such small systems. And of course, what I mentioned earlier, what I showed you with the impact of the vestibular system in these mice, in these short-arm centrifuges, it's very hard to have a vestibular challenge because the head is closely to the center, so there's hardly any gravity stimulation to the head, and even if you use things like galvanic stimulation, it's very difficult to do that. This is the point of obesity and weight I introduced earlier to you, that when you are under hypergravity conditions for a long period of time, with these animals at least, we see a reduction in fat mass. So, and here you see the increase in obesity in at least 15 European states. And it was a paper from 2002, but it cost like 32 billion euro every year to the society in Europe because of this obesity and overweight issue. We also know that we learn more about that other speakers during this symposium, that microgravity has very much links to aging. A lot of processes you see in aging are similar to what you see in healthy young astronauts. So also there, you might think that we could do something with hypergravity. Not that you would getting younger when sitting in the centrifuge, but at least you can explore the impact of long duration hypergravity with respect to aging parameters. This is my favorite guy, Superman. Those who read the book of Superman might know that he was born on Krypton. And Krypton is a planet which has a higher gravity than Earth. This is why the guy could jump higher and run faster and whatever than a human being, because his musculoskeletal system was much more elaborate compared to the human being. Yeah? So we are very on nowadays in terms of athletics. Yeah. In terms of athletics, we are very much used to high altitude training or high temperature or relative humidity training. But what about high G training? Would that be an applicable area for hypergravity application? I will skip this, I think. Yeah. Do we have time? Oh, okay. Well, we go back. 7 minutes, that will do. So if you think about the gravity continuum, which was one of the titles of the presentation here, here we go from microgravity to 1G to hypergravity. And I think what we should do in terms of science, we should explore the full spectrum. Yeah? We should really learn about what happens at microgravity, compare that to 1G, but we also should look in intermediate G levels. And here I put Mars and Moon G, which is very sexy nowadays, to look into it from a scientific point of view. 0.5G or 0.8G is as interesting as 0.16G. From an operational point of view, it's another story. You can also use centrifuges to predict something what happens under low gravity conditions. Yeah. So this is what we call the extrapolation. So you do your experiments. This is 1G, this is microgravity, and this is XG, whatever the X is of your system. And here you do all, a series of experiments under 1G, 2G, 5G, or whatever G level, up till 1G, what you can do on Earth. And then based on the data you have, you can extrapolate in what to expect at lower G conditions. It's not that you know what happens, but at least you can make a prediction. So that's another way of using centrifuges to say something about what happens under low conditions. And the reduced gravity paradigm is another one you can use to say something about what happens at low gravity conditions. This is, let's say, a standard microgravity experiment. You go from 1G, you launch your human being or your sample, whatever it is, and then you go into microgravity and you have a sort of adaptation, and that's what it is. Yeah? What you can also do is to load your subject or sample in a centrifuge at, for instance, 3G. You do that for a long period of time, so you have a steady state at 3G, and then you lower your centrifuge. Either you stop it or you lower to a lower G level, and then also you have an adaptation here to a lower G level. And the hypothesis here that these changes are comparable. Not the same, but are comparable. Yeah? So they go into the same direction. So also here you can, although it sounds a bit strange, you can use a centrifuge for microgravity simulation. Yeah? That's what you do. So you cannot read, but it's fine. It's the idea that counts. So we have a very large group of people, of which some of them are in the audience also here, where we want to look into this human hypergravity habitat design study. It's a study we proposed for the European Commission to really look into, would it make sense to build such a very large centrifuge for chronic human hypergravity exposure somewhere. And so we have people of all disciplines: cardiovascular, muscle, bone, life support systems, technology, vestibular, of course, very important. All disciplines that are relevant, to this system are included in the program. And we want to fill out this map. This is work in progress. What he said, we know quite a lot about what happens to humans under microgravity conditions. We know reasonably well what happens to animals under microgravity conditions, so not as much as humans. We know about humans and aging. We know about humans and obesity. We know quite some on hypergravity in animals. And this is what we're going for. I mean, could we use the human hypergravity habitat as a sort of research platform, both for diseases like obesity and aging and that sort of things, but also to prepare ourselves for future spaceflight with respect to a large rotating system. So if you look into this graph, stepwise go into a rotating spacecraft. I mean, we had a lot of knowledge from universities and research institutes, which is now took place in Mir Station and now into ISS. And of course, we want to go further on, like in this Asgardia setup. But I think what we need to do is to go and to do research in large rotating facility on Earth to learn about chronic rotation and mild hypergravity before we can go to LEO, low Earth orbit, or going to Mars in a large rotating system. And also, if we go to Mars, I mean, Mars is 0.16 G, but we don't know whether 0.16 G is good enough to maintain a healthy physiology. Yeah, it might still not be sufficient for a human being to live healthy in such a G environment. And of course, you have these world ships, as introduced by Larry, which is really like hundreds of years away. But also there, I think we need to go for a rotating device if we want to go in that area. So, and this is where we are at the moment. So, so in summary, the H3, the human hypergravity habitat, for the ground-based work, we can look in these contemporary diseases, human physiology, gravitational physiology, aging effect, and sports. Coriolis, I did not address that one; it's not relevant for this audience at the moment. If you look at the H3 for space exploration, you have to learn about rotating spacecraft, look in this reduced gravity paradigm. Gravity transitions is a very important issue. And of course, if you have such a large device, you can also look into group psychology, life support systems, and so on. And of course, it's also important, if you have such a facility, to look into outreach and education, which would be a very important part of it. And of course, for this audience, it might be a very good first habitat for Ascaria as a sort of pilot system. So, paving the road to living in space, which is the title of this symposium. How do we feed the Ascaria community? think the feat should be, one of them is psychology. I mean, you need to be, and this is the Maslow pyramid. I mean, from a psychological point of view, you need to be healthy, and you need certain criteria to come to that. And of course, the society part is also important. What I want to go into is into the physiology, which I explained to you a lot, also with respect to animal research and human stuff. And this is a life support system. This is an image from either ESA or NASA, I don't know. Where, I mean, you have in this life support, you have to provide O2, you have to scrub CO2, you have to provide humidity and recycle the water, you have to provide food, and so on and so on. But what is missing in all these life support systems is gravity. I think gravity should be part of a life support system. We need gravity to have a proper life as much as we need oxygen to have a proper life. Yeah? So sustained gravity should be an integral part of spaceflight life support systems. That's my point here. So how do we feed the Asgardia community also with a sufficient amount of gravity? That's where we need to feed the Asgardia community. So take-home statements. Gravity has always been present during the evolution of life on Earth. A sufficient level of gravity is required for healthy life. Not known if moon gravity 0.16 is sufficient to maintain a long duration healthy life. Gravity should be included as an essential part of a life support system. Mild chronic hypergravity has a positive effect on the immune system, aging and obesity. I showed you that, at least in animals. We need to know more about humans. An in-flight large diameter centrifuge is the most likely countermeasure to neutralize the unhealthy effect of near weightlessness. And studies using a ground-based large centrifuge for chronic rotation devices for humans are needed before ethically acceptable long-duration space missions. And I meant ethically because this is, I think, lacking in current spaceflight. If I have another 30 seconds, no? 30 seconds? Okay. If I'm a bit too old now, but if I'm 35, 40 and I want to have a new job and then I apply with an employer and say, yeah, come and work for me. But if you come and work for me, you're going to lose bone, you're going to lose muscle, your immune system is a bit deprived, probably you're going to not sleep that well, you get back pain, I don't know, all kinds of things, but hey, come and work for me. I mean, it's very unethical if you would go and go for such a job. So, and I think we can use long duration hypergravity to take away these negative effects of near weightlessness. Yeah? And so I think it is also unethical to deprive human crew from gravity. And it could be a short arm to start with, but I think in the long term we should use long arm centrifugation to do so. So with that, I would like all the people that provided the information for this presentation, those people that maybe are interested in this whole thing and work together on this large radius hypergravity facility, and Asgardia for the interest of this. So with that, thank you very much.
All right, so our next speaker is Tigran Makoyan. He's a PhD candidate at Delft University in the Netherlands. He is specialized in advanced control and motion cueing for pilot training, and he will talk about the Coriolis effects in rotating space platforms for space travel.
Thank you. Okay. Everyone, welcome. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for the honor of speaking next to these very influential names, such as Professor Lawrence Young, Anna Diaz, Mr. Satoshi, Dr. Jack. What I will talk today is about rotating spacecraft, as we touched upon quite a few times, and mainly how Coriolis effect, which I will explain later, affects the design of the spacecraft. So I want to start out with this question. This has been touched upon a few times, but who has seen the movie 2001, Space Odyssey? Raise your hand. There's quite a few. Everyone, I guess, remembers this rotating spacecraft. So we're now in 2019. But is there a rotating spacecraft flying right now? And the reason is, there are many reasons, but it's complicated. And it's linked to logistical reasons, physiological reasons of humans, and one of the things that I will talk about is the Coriolis effect. So just let's zoom in a bit more into this rotating spacecraft. Now imagine you're a human and you're situated, you see that orange camera view? So that's where you're situated, in one of these habitats. And you're looking straight to the center of rotation. And this is what you see. But now there is a rotating environment where you have your vestibular organs that picking up this rotation. And any rotation that you make outside of this rotational axis will cause this vestibular response of your semicircular canals, because we have 3 in each axis. In aerospace, we have the rotation yaw, pitch, and roll. So what will happen actually? And something like this, if we had to visualize it roughly, this is what your brain will visualize when you will rotate your head outside of this rotational axis, and you're rotating like this. So this work is been based on the publication that was presented at SciTech, and I have a bit less than 10 minutes. It's quite a challenge, but we like challenges in the Netherlands and Delft, so I will try to summarize the work that we did. So we looked at, this is a centrifuge, 2-axis centrifuge. It's a passive centrifuge where pilot doesn't have control, but where I did my experiments was in the Desdemona motion simulator, which is a dynamic flight simulator, has 6 degrees of freedom, and you can actively control at least 5 of them. And when you do it, you can do very complex motion cueing, you can do very complex scenarios, fighter pilot training. So I did my experiments in this simulator, and what I looked at is how I can mitigate the Coriolis effect while the pilot actively controls this simulator. And one of the things that you have to realize is you're in a simulator. We talked a lot about centrifuges. And the reality for the pilot is you see a scenario. So you're flying in a trajectory. And in my experiment, it was through a Grand Canyon. And the pilots had to fly 9G profiles. And I had to follow a track in 3D. And I had to come up with a motion cueing algorithm that predicts their behavior on the stick, and that prepositions the simulator in such a way that there was less Coriolis experience. And you see here a pilot flying in the Desdemona, and for the pilot, he experiences the whole visual and 3D stimulus. What we do in a simulator, we have to rotate such that we accommodate this resultant vector with the pilot being pushed in the chair, basically. And the problem there is that if you have this rotational environment, and on ground we had in yaw, as we say in aerospace, and in a spacecraft we would have in pitch. So any head movement that you make, left or right, will cause a cross-coupling effect, and mathematically you can just a pure pitch, the theta, pure pitch rotation around the x-axis will cause this cross-coupled rotation. You will pick up with your semicircular canals this rotation because there is a rotation existing, and then you tilt your head into it and you pick this up. So now, how does this relate to spacecraft? Let's look at just very basic spacecraft design. There was briefly discussed about short arm centrifuge, long arm centrifuge. What I want to show is if we go for a short arm centrifuge, how short or how long does the centrifuge need to be? So first of all, we want 1G condition. For that, we calculate the resultant. And this gives us a certain radial velocity of the spacecraft. Now, if we take the Spaceship 1 from the 2001 Odyssey, it's all estimated, it's very rough numbers, but the mass that it requires and the radius, 150 meters, will require us 87 flights. And currently with the Falcon Heavy, we will need a cost of 8.7 billion, if I'm correct. Yeah. And we would have only 0.26 radians per second. So here, we might not have a Coriolis effect. But it's not realistic in terms of it's very expensive. So what if we go to a more realistic design, and in just one single flight with 15-meter radius, we create a short arm radius spacecraft with only 15 meters radius. For that, we need a rotational velocity of 0.99 radians per second. And this is feasible only in one flight with the Falcon Heavy. So will we experience the Coriolis effect? And for this, there was, in the study, there was a perception model proposed. It's called the SRM filter. It's based on the simple kinematics described by Holy, and which take the input, the rotations of the spacecraft and human head, and it's filtered through a second-order filter, Haussmann filter. And what you get out is the perceived accelerations in all the three axes of your semicircular canals. And basically, the whole second-order model describes this organ in each axis. So when we are in the spacecraft, we perform head tilts only 10 degrees, like this, and we're rotating like this. Let's see what will happen if we filter this through. And we see that we actually pick up this rotation in one of the opposite axes, as I described. And if we take the thresholds, for example, by Groen et al. Of 0.5 degrees per second square, we see that we're actually pretty close, only 10 degrees of head rotations. So what does it mean? 15-meter radius spacecraft. What do we will see? Like, if we just go back briefly, you're in the spacecraft. Spacecraft is rotating. You tilt your head, and this is what will happen. So this is not sustainable. So one of the solutions that was proposed in the study that I worked on was to preposition the pilot, and basically to allow a mismatch in the gravitational vector. And there was a prior experiment performed to assess how much mismatch is allowed, such that you would not experience this mismatch in the G vector. And based on this number, a coherent alignment method was developed that uses this lead and lag mechanism predictively to preposition the human. In a simulator, this will work. You see here that yellow line is basically it's flattened response of this cabin rotations, which causes less Coriolis rotations. This was achieved and this was tested, and it was positive. It was found to cause less dizziness, less sickness. But of course, this is not sustainable. This is not possible in a spacecraft. You would need very complicated mechanism. So one of the things that I didn't look into that I recommended is to look into galvanic vestibular simulation. And now a few companies that work on this, one focuses more on inducing a sense of motion by basically zapping into certain areas behind your head and mastoid. And one focuses more on mitigating the sensation of motion. And the first one actually might be used in this short arm radius spacecraft. So to conclude, Coriolis effect can be perceived at 50 meters 15 meters radius spacecraft up to. If we have a very large ship, we might get rid of this Coriolis effect. The common method that used on ground in the dynamic flight simulators is not feasible, most likely in spacecraft, and there's possibly non-invasive solutions exist that might need to be investigated and researched into. So with this, I would like to conclude, and I would just like to ask you to ponder on how far would you be prepared to reach Mars and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to introduce our last speaker for the session, Professor Satoshi Iwase from Aichi Medical University in Japan. Professor Iwase's research interest in gravitational physiology include microgravity produced by parabolic flight, water immersion, dry immersion at bed rest. He also concentrated in the study of artificial gravity and organized the international team to study artificial gravity in the International Space Station. He also receives the Life Science Award from International Academy of Astronautics in 2013. Professor Iwase will talk about artificial gravity on board the ISS. So please welcome Dr. Iwase.
Thank you, Anna. This moment, next one. Yeah, today's talk concentrated on first the artificial gravity device in Nagoya University, which has the diameter of the 4.0 meter. The second one is the artificial gravity device in Gifu University Medical Sciences. It had the diameter of the 2.8 meters. And lastly, I will talk about the artificial gravity device on board International Space Station. Yeah, first the short-term centrifuge with the ergometric exercise. The first one is the 4.0 meter in diameter. We manufactured the centrifuge ergometer at the 2G load at heart level at maximum. And when we received the 1G at the heart level, the rotating speed, velocity is the 3 seconds per one rotation, which is the 20 RPM, which gives us the 1G at the heart level in this device. So maximum load is like this, and exercise load is the 5 kilogram meter at the ergometric exercise when you get on the bicycle. This is the what we next one, please. Picture of our centrifuge. We call it a cuffing. And this is the first time which I will go on this centrifuge. It was the 25 years ago. Very young. And next one is the subject is the okay, yeah, I see, thank you.
Okay, I'll give you another one.
And this is the, yeah, okay. The subject covers their eyes because the rotating scene is very troublesome, and he is bicycling, and this is rotating for this 20 RPM. We loaded the subject, the resting 1G, 10 minutes, 1.2G, 1.4G, 0.2G up to, and each 5 minutes until the subject complains these kind of the criteria. In our study, all subject complained this kind of the please stop, and then we will discontinue. And if we see the level of this discontinuance level all out, we call it this area as the anti-G score. So this G score, if this area is larger, his G tolerance is high. And we compared this area as the G tolerance level. Then, what we cause the subject the microgravity simulation? We used the head-down bed rest. This subject is heading down and laying down for 20 days. And half of the subject would receive the artificial gravity rotation with exercise. We compared the control subject and exercising subject, and what happened, the difference. We called it the protocol at the, sorry. G exercise step-up protocol. Subject received the 1.4 G at the heart level with 60 watt of the ergometric exercise. This is the very standard level of the exercise. And load was suspended when subject complained all out. And the gravity was stepped up by 0.2 G. When the subject endured for the 5 minutes, the exercise load was stepped up by 15 watt. And subject endured for next 5 minutes. So this kind of the G and exercise step up protocol and compared the G tolerance level. This is what the subject is laying down head with the -6 degree head down bed rest. And this is a rotation, and this is how subject is receiving the tilt test before and after the bed rest study. And the result is, next please. This is how subject is taking his lunch in lying down, and this subject is carried by the car to the next experimental room, and this is he is learning the very difficult law book. Body weight is a little bit changed in countermeasure group, and but not significant. This is the change in urine volume. This is the change of the volume of water drunk. So countermeasure group would have the little drinking water. Next, please. Yes, this is very interesting. This is the plasma volume, circulating blood in a subject of the countermeasure group, and this is a control group. You can see the circulatory blood volume is decreasing about the 60 or 20% in 20 days. But in a countermeasure group, his circulatory blood volume won't change significantly before the experiment. These 21 days of the head down bed rest. Next, please. Yeah, this is G tolerance, and you can see in a control group and post group. In control group, the G tolerance is significantly reduced, but in a countermeasure group, G tolerance is not so changed. So the tilt test shows that the this countermeasure would did not change his tolerance level. Next, please. Yeah. Sorry. Next, please. This is the sympathetic nerve activity. We can record the sympathetic nerve activity from they are human beings, from his tibial nerve. And the level of the sympathetic nerve activity increases as the tilt angle is large. And countermeasure group, sorry, yes, please. In a countermeasure group, the increase not changed, but in control group, since the sympathetic nerve activity in a lying down level is significantly increased in a standing level, which shows that this countermeasure would not change the sympathetic response after the microgravity exposure. And this is the how the blood pressure and change, not so changed, sorry. Next one, please. Yeah, this is the maximum oxygen uptake before and after the bed rest. And you can see that the this is the maximum oxygen uptake, significantly, a little bit significant, but reduced in a countermeasure group, but no change in control group there's decrease, but in countermeasure group there's no change. And this is the maximum oxygen uptake per body weight, and this is significantly reduced in a control group, but the countermeasure group showed no change. And this is the heart size change before and after the bed rest. Stroke volume and cardiac output has compared before and after the bed rest, and there is significant decrease in stroke volume and cardiac output. Especially stroke volume is significantly decreased, but there is no change in a control countermeasure group. It's echo Doppler cardiography, and this is the myoatrophy of the muscle. There is a significantly reduced in size in muscle in a control group, but no change in a countermeasure group. So countermeasure on myoatrophy in both the quadriceps femoris and the gastrocnemius serous muscle did not show the differences, but between countermeasure and control group when compared the pre and post bed rest measurements. Not significant, but there is a tendency. And next one is, this is bone metabolism. Bone metabolism is the, we compare the level of the deoxypyridinogen in urine, and in control group there is the increase in deoxypyridinogen in urine, but in counter group they are suppressed. So in bone metabolism, countermeasure ameliorate the effect of the microgravity. Sorry, this is it. So in summary, in whole systems, there's a tendency to ameliorate the effect of microgravity by the artificial gravity with the exercise. And we compare the deconditioning systems like the cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, bone metabolism, thermoregulation. You can see the Gunga's study that in microgravity, our core temperature increases, so-called space fever. But this space fever is ameliorated by this countermeasure. And all these kind of the systems were suppressed by the countermeasure, that is the artificial gravity with exercise. This is the new centrifuge, like the in our Agri project, we made this kind of the 1.4 meter in diameter centrifuge. So if our system is effective on this 2.8 meter diameter centrifuge, that might be beneficial. So first we make this kind of sitting position protocol, but this showed in maximum it will be a 1.2 G. So we, next one please. Yeah, we changed the position, like lying down and legs up. This causes the maximum at 2G at heart level. So by using this device, we compare the head down bed rest study in a short arm centrifuge, and in anti-G score, there is a tendency to increase in a countermeasure group, but the decreased in control group. And next one, please. Yeah. Bone formation marker is a little bit increase in a countermeasure group, osteocalcin, but decreased in a control group. So these kind of the systems, the same results in a 4 meter centrifuge as compared with the 2.8 meter centrifuge. And as Dr. Nishimura showed in a poster session, we compared the body fluid change during hypergravity and artificial gravity study. The fluid shift from head to direction, there is the tendency to decrease in impedance. That means the increase in a fluid shift. And abdomen is the increasing, thigh is increasing, upper arm is increasing. These kind of the systems show the decrease in fluid shift. So in a fluid shift during 1G load, we can see that there is a percentage of the chest at 12% and upper arm is the 6%, abdomen is an increase in 4%, and thigh is the decrease in 1%. So by using this kind of the artificial gravity system, fluid shift can be prevented by this artificial gravity. Let me explain the Agri project, which Dr. Yang or Jack Van Loon shown in their previous shows. And in Agri project, we have the investigator team in a whole world, and in 2009, Life Science and Space Medicine International Proposal AI system has been accepted, and we will put this multipurpose module in a diameter of 3 meters and sitting and rotating, this kind of the situation. And we will do the ground-based studies, and JAXA will launch the ATV, and NASA will present the side of the experimental offer, and ESA will have the development of the machine. And in that module, the subject is sitting and rotating like this. Yes. In this system, the rotating center will be at the head level. And like this, the mass will be total mass will be this kind of about the 400 kilogram. And this is how the study will carried out. And landing would be, I think it will be 2015 or 16. And measurements are like this, and monitoring is like this. So in milestone, it will be, it might have been like this, and it should be ended at the 2015, 14, but it was cancelled. I'm not sure the real reason. Unfortunately, it was cancelled due to the main reason would be a vibration produced by rotations at the ISS, and I'm not sure, but there is a rumor that the ESA budget problem and the JAXA is a very weak position at that time, so I think this kind of problem will cancel the AGRI project. So after the cancellation of the AGRI project, first the need for a study on a long arm centrifuge, which will be a H3 project that Jack Van Doorn has been presented, and need for study on a short arm centrifuge on lunar base and a Martian expedition. It should be installed on a lunar surface laboratory and a Martian spacecraft. Like this, we will put that on ISS in a Kibo, Japanese station. The JAXA has proposal for installation of this HTV at the A2 rocket. So it will be installed until the end of the ISS, but it has been proposed but not completed, realized. It will be installed in HTV, and it put on a Japanese Kibo experimental module, and here will be presented, so there will be no effect on a ISS structure. This is in which the short-term centrifuge would installed. HTV6 at this kind of the installed, and pressure cargo like this part will be installation area. And like the Agree project, the subject is sitting down and have the cycle regulator would rotate himself. Radius will be 1.6 meter, and at bike speed of the 18 kilometer per hour, the rotation rate is 30 RPM. 1.5 G at feet will be. And concept of operation is launching and putting the HTV at the keyboard, and then after the 6 month, which we are released, and then re-entry. So this kind of the HTV will be. And in our future studies, this study has not been completed, or proposal had not been accepted, but now we have the consideration of the in the next year we will have the discussion of the installation of this module on keyboard in ISS. So as the other researcher would suggested that the issue of the artificial gravity with the systems approach, which have the neurovestibular, cardiovascular, and autonomic, and free shift is the next one issue, and as well as the SANS, ocular symptoms, and as well as the brain change will be also a problem. And bone marrow metabolism will be cause the problem, and hematological and immunological problem will be solved or not. Hematological problem is the so-called space anemia, and immunological problem is the decrease in T cell system, which cause the subject or astronaut will be weak for the virus infection. So like the movie Martian, this will be a rotating system, so that in this area, the astronauts will stay here and have the 1G state, 1G living. Sorry, next please. Yes. This is the Space Odyssey. In conclusion, so artificial gravity with exercise will provide the countermeasures for several aspects of the spaceflight conditioning. Using 4 meter or using 2 meter of the centrifuge, we can obtain certain results to achieve the effectiveness of the artificial gravity. To load of the artificial gravity on ISS, new models should be considered, and we made a new model for the ISS. Next step will validate the effectiveness of this 2.8 meter arm centrifuge for countermeasure, providing the effectiveness to prevent the spaceflight deconditioning. Long-term perspective for large human centrifuge should be made in the near future. This is our concept. In a micro G, our system would go to the adaptation to the microgravity conditions. And if we live in micro D conditions, there will be an adaptation to the microgravity. like the hypogravity on the moon or on the Earth. But there should be a point of no return to the 1G environment. Therefore, we propose not to adapt to the micro G condition, but continue to adapting the 1G condition by the artificial gravity with the exercise, or artificial only might be good. So in our philosophy, sorry, just a moment. Next one. Oh? Yes, this one. What we want to say is longer adaptation to microgravity is unnecessary. So with this philosophy, we believe that the humans will achieve the safe and comfortable spaceflight without adaptation to microgravity. This is our consideration. And next one. This is the collaborator of the study, like the international co-investigators to attend the AGRI meeting. Therefore, the next one is thank you very much for
Thank you, Dr. Iwase. Just a few seconds, we are going to set up the stage to start the round table. We have a few minutes of questions with our speakers. So just hanging in there for 30 seconds while we prepare the stage.
My thingy fell.
Good. Test.
I'll bring.
you.
Can we get the glass next to you?
Thank you.
All right, so I think we don't have a lot of time, so let's use the stars. We have 15 minutes to do to talk a little bit more about artificial gravity. So the idea is also to take questions from the audience. So I'm just going to start with a couple of questions, and then we can keep moving. So let me start with the obvious question to warm up a little bit. Every study that you have presented during the session have shown that artificial gravity works. Everyone agree with it, it's great. So why do you think we haven't really implemented it further, try to put humans in space? It seems the obvious thing to do, and we have been in this situation for a long time. So maybe this is a hard question, but why do you think this is not happening, and what do you think would be the next step to make it happen, and maybe taking into account commercial entities that are coming into play, or the space tourism that is coming? So what are your overall thoughts about future implementation of AG in space? And it's an open question for whoever want to take it.
I'll give you my opinion on it, that there are two principal reasons. One is that it is deemed unnecessary. Every time we see a successful result from an exercise protocol, including the successful ARED that's been used on the International Space Station, this decreases the pressure to go to artificial gravity. Second is that AG, by its very nature, is complex, expensive, massive, and therefore there are a host of reasons that one might say, well, let's avoid flying this heavy device which would possibly damage the space station if we can get away with simply using an exerciser.
Well, to add on to that, I mean, I went into some old literature from the 80s or something, and even the work from, I think it was Joosten from JSC, that really looked into rotating spacecraft, so not, let's say, short arm, but longer arm rotations, and it's not that much expensive to do. I mean, it's the perception that it's very expensive to have a rotating spacecraft. So I'm not talking about short, but rotating spacecraft. Yes, it's more expensive, but not like twice or three times as expensive, maybe like 30, 40 or 50%, that order of magnitude. And the point I made at my very last slide is ethics. I mean, we have to, probably I'm not supposed to say that, but I'm waiting for the first astronaut to really develop a renal stone issue. I mean, then it would change also at NASA level, at headquarters, to think about this problem. I mean, the work from Vico showed that even a year after, although the IRED and whatever exercise, I mean, you still have a reduced bone mass. So a lot of problems have not been solved. And you see the VIRP issue, which came up a couple of years ago. People thought it was because of the high CO2 content in ISS. So within a year, the CO2 content of ISS could suddenly be lowered. But I mean, the gravity has to be increased in ISS because that is also an issue. You don't die immediately. I mean, it takes a couple of years, but it's a health issue. If I would go with these symptoms to a physician and say, well, I'm losing bone, I'm losing muscle, my immune system goes down, I have backache, you're going to be admitted. Yeah?
Right. Yeah.
And somehow we accept it for astronauts to happen, which is strange. That's an ethical issue.
Yeah, and in terms of the price, I would argue now it's becoming cheaper to send things into space as well. So that's another.
And even if you go for cheaper, I think there are business people here in the audience. If you think about a space hotel as a business model, but which doesn't rotate, stop it. I mean, if I would be a person that could afford a 1 million or 5 million trip to space, and I pay for that, but for about a week, let's say, or 2 weeks, yeah. But half of that time I feel awful. I mean, the chance that I feel awful because of the space adaptation syndrome is pretty high, and then I pay a couple of million to spend my money onto being sick for 5 days. I think it's not a very good business model.
All right, I think we have a question from the audience over there. Do we have some mics? I think someone is coming to you, sir, for the question.
Thank you very much. One thing, we have had a big fight from ESA with NASA in the beginning days of the space station was about pressure. We thought, or some of us thought, we should have much lower pressure in the space station because you have thousands of people who live above 3,000 meters and so on. They get along very well with low pressure. So the factor of low pressure, adaptation to it, which is easy, does it have any connection to the lower gravity, or would it be a good thing to mandate that we will have low pressure in all these station things, much easier for excursions outside and so on? We could put in a little more oxygen if that is needed, but low pressure, beneficial or not?
The pressure itself is not so concerned with the human being living. The decisive matter is the oxygen partial pressure. So that if you keep the oxygen partial pressure in the space station, it is very okay, so that the 0.3 atm pressure at the pure oxygen seems to be enough for the living. But the human being will receive some oxidation problems in pure oxygen conditions, so that the certain amount of the helium or nitrogen will be necessary to increase the pressure of the other gases.
Yeah, but not 1 atmosphere, because the people living in the mountains can do with a lot less.
People living in the mountains have the low oxygen partial pressure, so that their condition will be changed. As the Nobel Prize winner in this year said that there will be a low hydrogen pressure causes the increase in erythropoietin, and that causes the increase in the red blood cells in our blood, which causes the in a good condition for the breathing, so that we can adapt to the low pressures of the oxygen in a high altitude. But if we live in normal pressure, oxygen partial pressure, normal oxygen partial pressure, that is okay. No change for the erythropoietin or other kind of the situations. Especially low pressure causes some evaporation in our vascular conditions or in our articulation. That causes the very painful, or some kind of the thrombosis occurs. So decompression of the nitrogen causes such kind of the problems. So we should prevent that kind of the low pressure problems.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I mean, there is a correlation between mass/weight and metabolism. So I expect at lower G conditions that you will have a lower metabolism as well, so that, you know, that would be in favor of a low pressure moon establishment, for instance.
You're quite right. There was vigorous discussion and disagreement in the early space station designs. And in summary, the engineering arguments are all in favor of reduced pressure from 14.7 psi down to less than 10. The reasons were that reduce the amount of time for pre-breathing when doing an EVA, and it reduced the amount of mass involved in the structure of the station because you can decrease the pressure difference between vacuum and inside. On the other side was the scientific community, which said, look, all of our control experiments are done at normal one atmosphere. If you see a change in space station in some biological measure, can we attribute that exclusively to microgravity, or do we have to say, well, maybe that's associated with an atmospheric change? Then our friends who lived at high altitude would say, what, you want us to throw out all of the experiments that were done in Denver, Colorado? So it ended up being resolved, as you know, with, the station can be reduced from time to time, can be reduced prior to an EVA excursion.
All right, I think we have a lot of questions from the audience, sir.
Good day, my name is Ben. I'm part of Asgardia, and one of my missions is to make sure that my citizens are safe in space. So this is for the two gentlemen from the Netherlands. If we look at permanent living in space, we can obviously not look at decreasing pressure every time something happens. So my question is the following. Based on the length of the radius of a spinning cylinder, have anybody done any calculations on what the minimum radius should be at, let's say, at a workable 1G, so that the Coriolis effect doesn't affect people? Because we can't have people being seasick the whole time while they're in space. So, for the gentleman that spoke first from the Netherlands, is that part of the experiment which you would be doing at a higher G level? Is there any correlation between G level and the effect of the Coriolis, the distortion?
Well, very good question. We did a pre-study for this human hypergravity habitat. It was an ESA-funded so-called topical team study where a large group of vestibular people, because these are the experts. I'm not a vestibular expert. Larry's better than that. But what came out of that study is that in principle we cannot, let's say for the ground-based system, we cannot work sub-threshold, so that you wouldn't feel or you wouldn't notice that you rotate. If you would do that, you need diameters in the order of kilometers. Yeah. But you can work adaptive, and that is why we come to this 150, 200 meter. It's not sure yet. I mean, one of the things we want to do in the near future to be more specific on that and to do tests to identify that. But you have two reasons. If you go for, so this is, let's say, what you can do in a rotating system where you can freely move. Yeah. If you're in a smaller system where you are fixed, then you can have other rotation, other speeds, let's say, or other RPMs. And there's another thing, if you think about Asgardia, and I don't know how many people you would like to accommodate in a rotating system, but then the number of people takes part of it, and then, I mean, because of that, you have to have a larger size anyhow. So if you go to these world ship sort of things, I mean, the diameter is not an issue from a vestibular point of view, it's more because of the number of people you have to accommodate. So then there won't be an issue anymore.
So the second part, the relation between the effects of the distortion caused by Coriolis effect and G level, has there been any study on that?
I may answer on that. If I get your question correctly, thank you for the question, by the way, very good question. In the slide, maybe I went a bit too briefly, I didn't have much time. But actually there was a brief study done based on this perception model that was proposed in the study. And the perception model is, it's kinematics on one side of rotational center rotation, and then the head movements around it. And these are filtered through this second order filter, which give you this perception of angular acceleration. So based on these, this perception model, this 15-meter diameter gave actually something that was already perceivable. And this is only head movements of 10 degrees. So imagine you're in this spacecraft, you're sitting, and then you're doing this 10 degrees. Then you would feel this Coriolis, vestibular Coriolis stimulus, the cross-coupling. And I've been in a centrifuge myself. I've done and designed experiments for the pilots, and I know what it is like in this short radius centrifuge where you're trying your best not to do any head movements, because as in this simulation, that was also part of the study that I briefly investigated into. You get your visual, your brain construct this visual image of everything spinning around. So this is not maintainable. You would not have a quality of life in this environment because you just have to sit down and watch TV and not move around. So indeed, you need to go to larger diameter. Going to larger diameter, more complex systems, more maintenance. It's much more difficult to launch all this. So I think it's first, we need to understand better on the small systems. We need to investigate on ground more when and how large the radius needs to be. There are different thresholds in the literature study that I took only one by Groen et al., but there are others that claim it's much higher, the one claims much lower. And these are studies mostly done in the 70s. And actually, when I came and I did my master thesis in at the company, the Stemna, I was looking into 70s research, and I was a bit sad that actually no one has picked up. Only very few people are picking it up and looking into this more modern simulators, how this affects propagate there. So I think what we should do is do more research.
Yeah, I'm a little more conservative than you are. I think that in fact the radius can be made smaller, the rotation rate can be made larger, providing you provide an adequate incremental rotation training. Many of our laboratories have gone and shown that you can take somebody who would normally get motion sickness symptoms when rotating at only 5 RPM, maybe 4 revolutions per minute. That's quite slow and making head movement. But expose them to it for 20 or 30 minutes a day for several days, and then you find that these people are quite well adapted. And they may not be adapted to other kinds of, the proper term is Coriolis cross-coupling, but they are able to do that. So I believe that, in fact, if it's important, we can pre-adapt everybody to relatively high rotation rates.
If I just may briefly comment on that, I fully agree on that, because actually that was part of the experiment. In the experiment, we had sessions that we trained before we assessed them in these the motion filter with this pre-positioning and the motion filter without. And we actually saw that in one day, their, let's say, toughness towards this sensation of cross-coupling immensely increased in just one day. And that's part of training, indeed.
As an example, how many of you have been on parabolic flights? Okay. How many of you have experienced any kind of nausea in parabolic flights? Then you look at the pilots and the cameramen and the crew on these flights, and they do it day after day without any symptoms. Are they supermen? No, they're adapted.
All right, this is a super interesting conversation, but I'm really sad to say that we need to wrap things up. Thank you very much to help me thank very much all the speakers today. And apparently we have a break, so everyone can go and get some coffee and get some refreshments And we'll be back here and start again at 3:50 sharp. So thank you very much.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks for your question.
I want to ask, was there any studies done on non-rotating methods of artificial gravity, like magnetism, things like that?
With animals.
Yeah,
Not with humans.
not with humans.
Humans don't fit in a superconducting magnet or a bitter magnet.